Today we talked about, we did a kickoff to the session. We talked a little bit about what are some of the needs and how people are developing solutions for the ODCA requirements. Then we talked a little bit about hardware, we talked about software, we talked about solutions and what solutions providers are doing, and now we're bringing it together to talk about cloud standards. And I have with me today Chet Ensign, who is representing OASIS, but is the Director of Standards Development and TC Administration for OASIS. Wayne Adams, who is the Senior Vice President representing the DMTF. Yael McGuire, who is representing the Open Compute Project and is the Chief Strategist there. And Pam Fusco, who is the President of the metrics for the CSA, the Cloud Security Alliance. So lots of work going on in the industry around cloud standards, good need for them, and we'll talk a little bit and let you ask some of the questions that you might want to ask. So just to kind of tee things off a little bit, there's really sort of this issue around standards, and I just want to frame it a little bit. Whenever there is a new change, things tend to be like the Wild Wild West. What happens is some vendors take certain types of approaches, want to jump on the lead and create their own type of solution. Then you have a whole bunch of other people who come in and want to participate in the market. And what happens is you have various vendors sort of grappling for direction, trying to steer the direction that things go, but then there are generally acknowledgement that things benefit from standards at the end of the day. And standards are, in my humble analogy, they're like the roads. I mean, it's nice when they're paved because it allows people to move fast. There's a clear direction to the road. And then it's really up to people who want to be able to compete how fast they want to be able to go, but they have to justify things in the road and within the constraints that have been provided. I think the challenge comes in is that if you make a road that's too narrow, that really doesn't allow for innovation or allow people to pass, doesn't really allow for that kind of flexibility or change in direction that people want to take, you can stifle innovation. And I think that is really the conundrum around standards. How do you do something that enables the industry? How do you do it in a way that allows multiple people to participate and get their feedback in, infrastructure, services, regulation all together, and at the same time allow vendors to want to participate, so we give them enough latitude to have an incentive to participate in this process. So with that as sort of a backdrop, I want to start off with our tweet polling questions. Hopefully you guys have seen these at least before, so know the general drill. But you'll text the keyword to 223333. And the question really is in what arena of cloud solution development is the need for standards development most acute? So what would you like to see the industry move forward on? The first one is quality of service. The second one is management. The third one is around security. The fourth one is around hardware infrastructure, and the last one is government or compliance. And I should have pointed out, for those of you that can't see, turn that out of the way, the quality of service is cloud QoS, the management is cloud ops, the security is cloud sec, and then for hardware infrastructure it's cloud HW for hardware, and then cloud compliance, which would relate to the government regulation. So feel free to go ahead and get those in. And while we're, while we are waiting on the results of that, I want to start by asking the first question. So we'll see in a minute what's most important to the audience here, but I want to ask you, what do you guys think is the most important thing? What are some of the things that you're seeing as the needs for standards in the industry, and why do you think they're important? So, anyone want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Representing the DMTF, it's been a long-standing organization that's created standards like the Common Information Model that's used by a lot of the typical application management application vendors to manage all the distinct elements that you have as part of your infrastructure. As that's getting extended now for the cloud, and plus the addition of the open virtualization format, that's moving that in that direction to be able to look at how to get the interoperability, portability, and security around in the cloud environment, and extending that from the enterprise. And so those are some of the basics from the sector of the industry that's looking at their own data center and how they're looking, how do they move workloads back out to the cloud, that they're looking for some of the familiarities of where they've been and how they're extending themselves, rather than doing a whole context shift of saying, well, maybe what Amazon or Google has done in-house to build out their type of skill-out management that's all homegrown in-house. They're not ready to just let all their legacy investments go. They need to extend that because they provide value in doing asset management and keeping the operations up and running.
I would say mobility right now. Mobile devices and the applications, not the device so much itself, but the applications. Standards from the business perspective and how to get them to, as you said, interoperability, flexibility, and meet the whole, burstable, on-demand, up-down type. And I think there's a keen call for that right now. There's standards across the board for multiple things, but I think right now that's one of the primaries, coupled with identity and access management, which is long-standing.
And it's just a quick question about identity and access management. Is that something that is particularly acute from your perspective in cloud environments?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the key aspects. If we haven't done it right the first time, we actually have the opportunity in the cloud to kind of get our hands around it and maybe get more cohesive with identity and access management. I think the concept of federated identity is still a bit of a stretch, but at least some uniqueness along the way to identify who you are as you hop along the food chain or bounce across the cloud. So I think that's definitely key, because without knowing the who, you can't really identify the what and the how, and you can, but you just can't tag it back to any particular, and do a prosecution if you have to.
And this is one of the things that I was thinking about when I was going over that question is in a way it's not so much do we need new standards for this for these particular areas. A lot of the standards are there. A lot of the standards for identity provisioning, identity management, authentication, privacy management. There's a lot of the foundational specs that are in place. What we really need is putting them into a form where the vendors have adopted them, the consumers understand their value and what they mean, and we know how they work together to make it, to deliver these capabilities to the market. So I think a lot of standards actually are in place. What we need to see is like the profiles that actually implement them for cloud.
Yeah, just to echo that point, I couldn't agree more. In the Open Compute project, there's a hardware management, not a standard, but a specification, which is trying to tie together a large number of standards that already exist, but trying to kind of more narrowly define them for specific application usage scenarios, where there's a number of vendors who are going to implement that, just so we can ensure interoperability. Because one of the things that's, I think, a challenge sometimes with sets of specifications is they can be so broad that they become inoperable between each other. And so, yeah, we're really trying to narrow that focus down by making this kind of meta standard on top of a set of open standards.
Are there any other things that you're seeing as kind of a burning need that you think the industry could, either things that are in flight already that just you want to continue to see the industry move forward on, or
Well, absolutely on hardware infrastructure.
Can't imagine why.
Somebody tweet that.
We definitely see that, but I think one of the things that is a lesson for us, and we're only kind of a year into the Open Compute project, is trying to think a little bit about how standards processes can happen. So right now we're trying to take this kind of rapid fire iterative approach where we're going to allow a standard to actually fail. It's not that a bunch of people will get together and you kind of have to get out on the other side where there has to be a success. We want people to propose projects, try to get to them to the point where they're either a standard or a specification that's built on a standard, and let the market and the industry decide if it's going to be valuable or not. Make it so it's easy for people to contribute intellectual property ideas, so on and so forth. Get prototypes, try them out, and if they fail, move on and go on to the next project. That's kind of the thing that we're experimenting with. So it's not necessarily the standards process that one might be familiar with, but we're trying to leverage as much standards as possible. We're trying to put this framework for innovation to happen, but focused on hardware infrastructure.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a number of things that are kind of standards of standards, or profiles, if you will, that people are looking at. And in fact, some of the work that's being done by the Open Data Center Alliance is building off of collaborations with each of your groups. Yeah, could we do the...
There was a question in the audience.
Oh, sir. Sure.
Did you have a question?
I was going to ask a question about standards. Aren't standards developed and designed to facilitate interoperability in terms of this whole cloud environment?
Sorry, I wasn't sure I heard that.
Aren't standards, because this IT is currently a standard for how to build a cloud platform. Isn't this supposed to be designed to facilitate interoperability?
So your question is, are standards helping to support interoperability between clouds,
Right.
correct?
Right.
Okay. So I don't know if you want to talk from a DMTF perspective about some of the work that's being done on VM interoperability. Feel free to take that.
Yeah, I'd say that majority of standards are designed for interoperability. However, some standards activities that do get going are meant to be shared engineering costs, so that there's a common platform that companies can further extend into their own offering. So it doesn't necessarily have to be exposed by that company to become an interoperable capability. So an example is the DMTF has the common information model, and many management application companies use that on how they build out a very distributed management platform. But it doesn't mean that you can take two different companies that have the common information model and plug them together and expect them to exchange information with the common information model. They may choose other methods and techniques. I'll contrast that with a different type of standard from the DMTF, like the open virtualization format, which is commercially adopted. You have companies like Citrix and ZenSource and VMware and others that have implemented it, and that's the ability to be able to recognize a virtual machine and be able to take the package of the application and the data and be able to reference it and move it to a different place to execute on it. So that's an interoperable standard. And usually you need to, for standards to be extremely successful, you've got to take that another step or two beyond just writing the technical specification. You need to get implementation experience, plug testing, and interoperability, which are some of the work projects that you're describing that the ODCA is doing with these proof of concepts to validate them. Otherwise, you can have a standard, but it may not be achieving its interoperability if you don't pull the community together to test with that.
And also standards, depending on if we're talking, private, public, hybrid, or community cloud, right? Your standards might be more stringent or less stringent. I think that, we're talking private, it's a little bit different. But public, of course, you probably want more cohesive standards for interoperability, because that's what it's all about. But then the private, whether they know it or not, plug in to the public and the hybrid. So it's kind of, like you said, interoperability, consistent. And I think we confuse maybe standards with standard configurations, right? So we have standards and then standard configuration models and so on and so forth.
On the OASIS side, on the flip side from technical standards, one of the initiatives that's just recently started up is the Tosca TC. The chair is actually here, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, but that's specifically the topic of that technical committee as well, is to give the consumers of cloud capabilities the ability to put together what they call service templates, models of their IT services and their life cycles, so that they have a common description of the capabilities that they need in a way that can then be mapped onto one cloud after another, specifically, again, to assist with doing things in a standard way with a standard vocabulary, so that we can make interoperability a really achievable objective.
So maybe we're ready now to go to our survey results. Can we pull those up here? And while we're pulling them up, just want to remind you, I'm going to open it up for general questions after this. We'll kind of see what the results are, see if there are other questions. I have some questions as well, so if you don't ask, then I will. I'd rather hear yours.
I'm surprised to see compliance.
All right, so what is the answer? Well, the two ones that look like almost a tie are cloud ops and government compliance. So making sure that from a management perspective, cross cloud and compliance, those are the two biggest. And then quality of service and cloud hardware both kind of come in second from there. And I guess everybody thinks their cloud is secure enough. So, or maybe there's so much regulation out there already. It's well, we got the standards covered. So, let me just open up, see if there are any questions that folks would like to ask the panel from a standards perspective. Okay, so while folks are thinking, I'm gonna
let me toss out like a industry reference point. I know a lot of people were trying to track different standards, and you can read different headlines at different points in time. There is a website that's been put together by a number of the industry associations called cloud-standards.org. And so that allows a lot of the industry associations to post their work so that it allows the ability to look at a standard stack, and that could end up, with different types of platforms that are out there in the open source community.
Building a resource.
Yeah, it is.
Is there any way to see it so you can see whether there's overlap between different efforts?
It doesn't go that granular, but it's also to help that the groups know that they don't get into, each other's space so for overlap, because like 10 years ago, it was common that you could end up with, overlapping standards, and then it splinters the industry, and then you never get to critical mass and adoption.
The Cloud Security Alliance has a stack of standards too. It's called the Cloud Security Matrix, and takes into consideration multiple standards on a global level across verticals, right? So finance, healthcare, manufacturing, you name it, and then brings in many of the federal standards. So you have a nice matrix that says, if I do this for a living, then check, 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 check. Where are the common ones, right? If you have to do, I don't know, let's use a regulatory requirement. HIPAA, GLBA, Patriot Act, EU Data Protection, 1386, right, if you want to get that. And you can look across and say, oh, I've got that if I do X, Y, or Z standard. So that's a nice matrix to kind of play into, I think.
So CSA is on the cloud standards.
Yeah, I know we are.
Okay.
We like each other.
Everyone's working well so far.
And
no fights
so's
have broken
OASIS.
out.
I'm not taking him on. He's bigger than me. You win.
Jason, that was a really good question, and I get this question a lot when I'm talking to people about ODCA, which is the relationship between ODCA and the standards groups and how it's collaborative. And can you just maybe talk about it and kind of get some of the panelists here's response on that and the relationship between the two? Because I think that does confuse some of the community.
So I'll start with an opening comment and then take it. I think, one of the things that I heard from the Open Data Center Alliance was there's a lot of work going on as a group of users. Let's try and help be clear about what requirements we have, and then maybe refer back to the groups, or maybe go ask some of the standards groups to take on or incorporate certain things rather than create overlap. And I thought that was a very smart move by the steering committee to go make that happen. So the next thing that came out of that was we'll go form some liaisons, and the groups that you see here each have liaisons with the Open Data Center Alliance, where the agreement is the Open Data Center Alliance will be able to focus more on the requirements, what the users would like to go do, sharing that information with each of the groups here, but not getting into writing the standards, since many of those standards are already being covered by these bodies. So that's a little bit of at least the strategy that I've seen and helped to support in that regard. And I don't know if you guys would have any comments about how that's working so far, or your perspectives on it.
I think as you get more of the proof of concepts, further expanded, I think you can get more involvement from the groups. Right now, you go out there, for example, I can see DMTF reference the Common Information Model, and one in the manageability requirements, and then another one talks about virtual management and then reference OVF and so on. But then sort of like, if you want to see those in practical use to see if those are meeting the needs, even though it's been stated as a requirement as a foundation. That's where we start to see if the standard's complete enough. It needs to have new feature sets that need to be extending it to make it fully applicable to the cloud work that LDCA members are expecting to see.
Right, the implementation support.
And it's good to have that, proof of concept. Otherwise, it's just a standard. And as you said, sometimes things fail, and we want to see if it fails before we kind of come and play together as alliance organizations. So the POCs are exceptionally important to understand adaptability across the board for standards that are applicable.
Good. Yeah, and it really kind of represents, again, sort of, both sides working together, and a lot of standards groups tend to, for a very good reason, be driven by people who have the deep technical expertise. They are vendors potentially in the industry who are developing the solutions, and having a partner on the consumption side to be able to do the POCs, work with. I think it makes for a very nice type of collaboration. So, John, thanks for allowing us to elaborate on that point. So, all right, so I got a question. So, each of you are working on your own sorts of initiatives. And like everything, there's sort of a risk of failure, something not panning out. Tell me what, I'd like to just go down through each of you, and tell me what you would be most concerned about. So if people don't adopt the standards that you're driving in the industry, what do you think the impact will be? Why should people want to comply and help advance the standards that you're putting in the industry?
Well, I think the bottom line from our perspective is if the standards aren't implemented, and if they're not there, if they're not easily adopted and integrated with your in-house units, is going to slow down the entire industry. People are going to be very risk averse. I mean, to me, that's what that bar for the government and industry compliance, the regulation bar, represents. It represents the fact that people are still skittish about the risk if they start putting data out there. You know, somebody was saying earlier today, it's one thing if you put a whole bunch of pictures up there that you used on your ads. It's another thing entirely if you start leaking data, you know, that's personally identifiable. So I think that people are going to be risk averse until they start to get the confidence that that they can go ahead and they can move stuff out into the cloud, and it'll be safe there. And I think that seeing the standards come together and get implemented gives people that assurance, that confidence that, okay, I can trust handing stuff over because I know what their commitments are, and I know how I can enforce it, and I know where we're going to go as a partnership.
Great.
You know, come back to the one, you know, launch point you're using if it's not picked up and adopted. So I believe the companies that are writing the specs will, you know, take that step, but then it's that relationship with the consuming side of the industry that's going to be driving it. You know, many times I'm in different type of speaking avenues like this, and they'll say, well, where's Amazon or Google or Microsoft Azure sit with this? And you go off and talk to their lead architect, and they'll say, well, when customers start asking for it, we'll pay attention to it. In the meantime, they're, you know, 100 miles an hour down the track that they're on. And so it gets to the point is, you know, there's certain parts of the of IT that standards serve a very good point of interoperability and controlling costs, because you have interchangeable solution sets. And there's other parts of the industry where you have a single vendor that'll dominate a technology but put it out there in a low enough cost point that it doesn't, a standard really doesn't do much for it anyhow, because it's not a place that people will differentiate on.
I think from a standards perspective, adaptability is important, but I'd like to twist it a little bit. I think having too many standards is just as bad as having not enough to adopt, or the right ones, because then there is no standard at the point. It becomes polluted in sort of a potpourri. But if I had to pick what I thought, I've been a cryptologist for 26 years, so of course I'm going to pick the one no one picks, security, right? But that being said, I think the standard there is some baseline, and if we don't, any one of those standards across the board, if we don't apply or attempt to apply, then it defeats the entire purpose of interoperability. We're not going to scale. You're not going to be able to be burstable, unidentifiable, plug and play with the industry. So you're going to go back into that, you know, one data center, more money being spent, and we're just going to end up back where we are. So I think that in itself, if I had to pick a business decision, it would be definitely for the interoperability, for the knowledge sharing and transfer. But of course, I carry the flag for security.
I think for us, because in part our community is a bit of an experiment, the careful balance between trying to push the innovation envelope, but also try to maintain some level of standards and making sure that the industry can catch up to adopt the technology, deploy the technology, and test it out, for us, I think is kind of the biggest tension that we face, and you know, we're kind of learning as we go. One of the other things I think is interesting about just anything with open source is that there's always the possibility of just fragmentation, because the IP is essentially freely licensable for people to go and implement on their own. And so we're really thrilled to see that people have been inspired by open compute technology. So Zynga sort of gave us credit for the Z Cloud initiative as being inspired by open compute technology. But when you see those kind of efforts, there's always the possibility of fragmentation.
So I want to just sort of check again to see if, sorry, were you going to?
Yeah, I was going to just make a comment about this particular market space on cloud. That there's a lot of, it feels like we're changing engines while we're flying. Where in some markets or years ago, usually you'd have multiple instances of a problem being solved, and then you could get those groups that have solved that problem then to come together and then define the standard that's the lowest common denominator. Here we have innovation still going on, and then we have some standards still trying to be developed in parallel, and so like the dust hasn't settled, and that's been some of the challenges about, you know, are the standards out there good enough, or do we need more? And then you've got open source as another platform as a way to address it that has innovation already baked in but may not have a standard in it yet.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge.
Okay. I just want to do a quick check. Raise your hands if there's any questions kind of from the audience. Yes?
I was kind of puzzling through VMware not joining the OpenStack initiative. And I thought, you know, if a vendor takes over so much of the market,
the proprietary.
they become a dictator of standards to everybody.
Just to repeat the question for the audience online. So the question was, VMware didn't join the OpenStack initiative. At some point, do people gain enough critical market segment share, fill in the blank, that they become a dictator and essentially obscure the need for standards? So thoughts on that?
I have a kind of a historical thought on that. When I look back at, again, security, right? Firewalls. And we, you know, taking this back to like 98, we had Cisco PICs. And then we had, you know, Checkpoint. And Checkpoint dominated the market, right? But the government couldn't use it because, you know, it was developed, oh my gosh, over there, right? But the reality, it was adopted because you could plug and play better. And they had the one-to-many solution, right? So I could manage, you know, 15, at the time, 15 firewalls to one firewall management station, woohoo, now it's like 15,000 to one. And a Cisco PICs was great if you wanted throughput on the internet, very powerful, but it was a one-to-one solution. But at the end of the day, if I wanted to build a VPN and do encryption, I had to be Cisco. I had to be Checkpoint, Symantec. Who changed that pattern to begin with to say, okay, let's stop being so, you know, customized, and the word is right on the tip of my tongue, proprietary, right? We've got to have interoperability. Checkpoint did it. They came out and said, I will build a VPN with you and you and you. So I think that you might see that sort of a dominance, but at the end of the day, you've got to have some level of, okay, let's all play nicely in the sandbox, or else they're not going to get all the business. Because, to believe it or not, I don't think the industry is tolerant anymore of a big papa in charge, and just that's the end of it. So I'm not sure that that'll happen again.
Any other thoughts or examples?
Just a viewpoint that, you know, besides OpenStack, there's other open platforms that are being also used for the cloud. And so I guess just like, you know, 3 years ago, everyone said, well, it's Amazon and S3, and that's the de facto, and so let's move forward. Why spin 20 vendors in an industry group to work on that? So it's, you know, it seems like every 2 years there's some other part of the cloud stack that we're having that discussion, and where's that community and energy at? So I believe that, you know, OpenStack is today, and, you know, a year or two from now could be yet another movement into another part of the industry to solve another part of cloud. And yeah, I agree, like economic, you know, rewards help bring companies into these different folds. And so partly, if you're one writing checks, you have the power in a pen is pretty hefty still these days.
Yeah, I think it's just the way that the auto industry, after the tsunami, really started to rethink their supplier practices. They'd been going down years and years and years to single suppliers, and all of a sudden they started to think, hey, we've got to have a broader set of suppliers, because we never know when one's going to when one's going to go under, and it could be that big one. And I don't think there's much appetite anymore to from a customer side to have all of your eggs in one basket, because I think people have seen that no matter how big, secure, rich, successful that player looks, you know, there's always the headline tomorrow when all of a sudden, whoops, they had a big data breach. Who would have ever expected that? So I think that the market is going to expect to have multiple suppliers, and they ultimately will not let any one party own the entire space.
De facto is dynamic, right? It's not, nothing is static anymore.
That's a good phrase.
You know, it could change 6 months from now, and I think that that's what we're seeing just by the adoption. And consumers are driving the internet. Consumers drive what we do. Big business drives 10% because consumer buys from big business. So if we look at what the consumers are doing, you know, the 5-year-olds even, that should tell us what we need to, where we need to be in 3 years. And we need to look at this picture a little bit more broader in order to get ahead of the game. To have a de facto that might last 24 months, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Great. Other questions from the audience? Yes?
What are the top 3 cloud-related standards that are most important in your mind from each of your backgrounds and perspectives? Which one should I follow or care most about? A lot.
So the question was, what are the top standards that should be on the radar screen of people here in the audience?
Well, I already mentioned TSCA, which has been mentioned as a top specification in a couple of industry addresses recently. It was listed by Angel Diaz at IBM's Innovate 2012. I think the president of SAP mentioned that. We think it's going to be an important enabler of portability. I think the security standards, XACML, SAML, OAuth, those are all going to be fundamental specifications that are really going to play a role. So those are sort of my top ones right off the bat.
Great.
From the DMTF, it's OVF and a new specification that we're just releasing in a draft form now called CIMI, C-I-M-I.
From a CSA perspective, we have the SecAS, Security as a Service. Well, you know, we have asses in the cloud, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, so we have SecAS, and SecSEC.
Do we need to bleep that for the viewers?
So sorry, I was a sailor for a long time. Was. Okay, your turn.
For us, one of them is a software interface standard on open hardware management. So, I mean, one of the big efforts, especially in the scale compute area, is how to make sure that the hardware infrastructure, you don't have to worry about on it at a per node level, because the application is already built-in redundancy to deal with individual node failures. So when you get down to the hardware and dealing with firmware management and provisioning and things like that, we want to make sure that you can really treat the data center as a computer. That's one effort. The other one is a big effort that's happened over the last 6 months called OpenRack, which is trying to focus on disaggregation of components in the data center. So it's well known that different components have different longevities and lifetimes. We might want to replace an Intel CPU in 12 to 18 months, but a power supply doesn't need to be replaced for another 6 to 9 years. So if we can disaggregate some of these components to make sure that different components can be swapped out and replaced easily at different timescales, that's a big effort towards the future. So we have that standard being put together, and then there's also support we're seeing from Tencent and Baidu on a parallel effort called Project Scorpio, and the goal is to converge those specifications next year. And we're also starting to get some actual devices being built to go into these rack solutions from like HP and Dell and so on and so forth. So pretty exciting.
Could I put one more plug in there?
Yeah, yeah.
So most of everything that was described here is about securing and managing the infrastructure. And yay. What about the data?
That's a part of security.
Or sometimes it isn't. So there's another group called SNIA, and they have a standard around cloud management of the data, and it's about metadata of how does the cloud handle the data once it's in there. It has a mindset of what typically in-house enterprise applications have done in terms of backup and distribution and deletion and authentication that's been deleted and so on.
Lifecycle management,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Good, good. So I'm going to ask another question while people kind of formulate some of theirs. So I kind of likened the standards to a road, and they're sort of varying widths of the road. How do you balance the need to go ahead and have a good, clear standard, but at the same time allow enough innovation opportunity? I mean, you have a membership composition. At one hand, all wants to agree, and on the other hand, doesn't want their differentiation somehow being sucked into the standard. How do you balance that?
Well, at OASIS, the agenda is driven by the members. So OASIS doesn't set, we're going to do this standard, we're going to do this standard, we're going to do this standard. The membership's coming in and saying, we see a need here. We want to get a group together and do this. So first of all, there's a sort of a self-selection process there. And then on top of that, there's the fact that everything's happening out in the public. I likened it the other day to, doing a tightrope walk without a net. All the documents, all the meeting minutes, all of the emails, all the exchanges are public. So they know that they're doing that into the public eye, and that anything they produce is going to have to go out for public review, open public review, that they're going to be answerable to before it can actually be finally approved. So it's that combination of grassroots, member-driven decisions about what's important, and the visibility and the transparency into the work that from our perspective, I think, makes sure we get the right balance.
Some standards, they're designed in the sense that there's the all agreed to functionality, and then you have the ability to do what's called vendor extension. So it's an extendable use of the technology, so that allows someone to differentiate and still use the same base technology, but it's up to a decision of them whether or not they want to bring that back into the organization or just retain that extension themselves just within their own offering. And so that way it helps with the traction, the interoperability of the overall standard for the whole community, but it allows them to differentiate and repurpose what they've just invested all that time in.
Actually, just a quick question. Are the licensing models ran for those organizations, or?
At OASIS, the licensing models are determined by the technical committees at the time they start. I think I did the math last week for a report. About 80% of the technical committees that are working today are working under royalty-free modes, either royalty-free on limited terms, which very tightly limits the license terms that can be applied, or non-assertion, where there will be no licensing claim made at all. I don't think we're doing any work on RAND anymore.
The DMTF follows the ANSI national body and uses RAND.
And so, how are you managing, Pam?
Standards?
Well, in this particular case, how do you manage the balance between what a Cisco might want, just since you used them earlier, and sort of the balance of the organization? How do you leave enough latitude for people to still innovate and at the same time kind of come up with something that's a clear enough standard?
I think it's a business decision, to be honest with you. You have your basic standards. How are you going to build your data center? How are you going to build your cloud? What are you going to use? What's your technology going to be? We focus a lot on the technology, but the technology has to drive the business. And I think it depends, too, on what an organization does for a living. Are you going to be a service provider, or are you going to do billion-dollar transactions? And such, I think that dictates a little bit differently how strict or how lenient your standards would be. But again, you don't want to stifle innovation. So you have to have that room to broaden your horizons. So I think that the paradigm there is, if you're using a provider, but you're doing trillion-dollar transactions, you would expect that they would adopt some level of your standard in order to support that, but yet be able to do it on a burstable level so that you can meet the demand to do a gazillion billion-dollar transactions. So I think that there's a happy medium. But again, going back to too many standards, not a good thing. I mean, I'll just use a regulation, for instance. Every state has at least, 2 or 3 different breach notifications. There's no way a business owner or a big business could keep up with what's happening in California, Massachusetts, let alone the EU and all the other areas that you have. In Asia Pac has a different privacy regulation. I think a baseline standard for something along those lines or activity of events would be beneficial that can be adoptable across the board as opposed to every single last one of them.
So are you proposing a group take on the standardization of government regulations? That would be, raise your hands, by the way, if you're interested in that. There's a couple takers.
I'm still mourning over the Devils losing. I can't take that on yet.
We'll commiserate with the beer afterwards. Yeah. Anything to add about how do you manage that?
Yeah, I think we take a similar approach, I think, to OASIS. It's a member-driven process to figure out what is going to be worked on, so there's no real overarching part of the organization. We do have a committee called the Incubation Committee, which helps projects come out of basically the first ideation process to become more of a formal project that will focus on developing specifications and standards. But at the same time, they're really giving the oversight of technically what that group will work on to the members themselves. Because this is hardware, we talk about things like innovation volumes. So for Open Rack, for example, there is a volume defined in the back of the rack where vendors are free to basically make their extensions that what you would find in software specifications. And then I think for us, coming back to this notion of failure and running things in parallel, we want to try to encourage somebody to try to think about, let's not even think about the road, let's try to make the jet car or the magnetically levitated car that's going off into someplace else, but allow the opportunity to thrive or fail if it doesn't get any traction. So we're trying to run things in parallel where everything's really lightweight. So we're trying not to use the word standard really for a lot of projects, just because we don't want people to lose sight of the fact that they can try something out and fail.
Organized innovation is probably a better word than standard, right?
Yes, yes.
We're renaming the standards groups. All right, so we have time for one last question. I just want to see if there's any in the room Okay, if not, here's the final question. So where can people go for more information? Where should they go?
OASIS-open.org for me.
Great.
DMTF.org.
CloudSecurityAlliance.org.
OpenCompute.org.
Woohoo.
And of course, you can always go to OpenDataCenterAlliance.org as well. So, and if there are other orgs here, feel free to point them out.
Away.
I want to thank the panelists today. You guys did a great job, and thank you very much for attending our session on standards and the overall service provider and solutions track for the day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.